Welcome to the Washington Monthly Show. I'm Paul Glastris, editor-in-chief of the Washington Monthly Magazine here in Washington, D.C. With me is my co-host and chief Washington Monthly blogger, Ed Kilgore, on the West Coast. Ed, good morning.
Good morning to you, Paul.
We approach the fall with all of our batteries recharged and looking forward to some fireworks this month of September. And we're very pleased to have as our guest today my friend Julie Mason, who is the host of the Press Pool on Sirius XM Radio at Channel 124, one of my favorite shows. And she's a longtime White House correspondent and is going to be talking to us about the news of the day, the campaign, the nature of the relationship between the Washington press corps and the campaigns in the White House and so forth. Ed, we're delighted to have Julie, but first I wanted to turn to you. You did some reporting over the Labor Day weekend at the American Political Science Association meeting in San Francisco, talking to our friends on the academic side of politics and campaign coverage. What was the headline?
Well, I don't know if there was a headline, but there was certainly a undercurrent of sort of confusion and unhappiness. Political scientists, I'm going to overgeneralize here, but by and large have a relatively fixed view of how presidential campaigns are supposed to operate and what they produce. Sort of the generalization is that party nominations are controlled by party elites, and general elections can be predicted with some certainty through various models that involve presidential approval ratings, economic indicators, and degrees of incumbency.
Yeah, so, this is the if the growth rate in of the economy in March of the year of the election is above 2.5%, the president wins.
Wins. And sort of a corollary of this, which is obviously troubling to political journalists, is that all this stuff that we read about every day is just noise. And I think the undercurrent I was picking up on pretty clearly in San Francisco was that the noise is getting pretty noisy this year, and that it's getting a little bit harder to fit actual developments out there, into the verities of political science, which again leads them to sort of put their fingers in their ears and say, la, 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 I can't hear you, ignore all this, nothing to see here, blah, blah, blah.
The models ain't working anymore.
Well, it was kind of like, attending a conclave of the Cardinals, a week after Galileo's theories came out. It's, again, I'm being a little sarcastic, and I do admire these people and respect them, but it is also kind of amusing seeing them try to make heads or tails out of things like Donald J. Trump. So that was kind of funny. And, at the other extreme, political journalists are very excited right now by all the game-changing events that seem to be occurring every other minute. So this cycle so far is fascinating, not just in terms of what's happening, but how much fun you can have watching the watchers and discerning their various preconceptions and agendas.
Well, as the author of a book on the 2014 race, where do you fall on the fundamentalists versus game-changing spectrum?
Well, I tend to be, sort of a, moderate fundamentalist, I suppose. I do think the fundamentals are real. A big part of my book actually was to suggest that fundamentals, particularly things like predictable turnout patterns in presidential and midterm elections, actually was the single most important thing that happened in 2014, which led me to question some of the media narratives of, a Republican Party sort of moderating itself and getting control of the crazies, and thus marching to victory. But however, at the same time, I acknowledged frequently that media narratives themselves become part of political campaigns and can have an effect, certainly on media coverage. So, put me somewhere in between. But I try to force myself. I mean, if somebody has to write 12 posts a day about politics, it's very difficult for me to just ignore things that are happening or constantly explain why they don't really matter. But we do need to occasionally calm ourselves as journalists and look at the bigger picture.
Well, and isn't the sort of the fundamentalist point of view, and that's that again, cheekily, it's really the political science modelers' position is not that they can predict with any certainty who's going to win a primary. It's
right.
that once all of the relevant forces interact in a general election, that the each side adapts to the other, and what actually matters at the margins are these larger forces, and so we're a little early in this cycle to begin deciding whether the models work or not, aren't we?
Well, yeah, but political scientists also have a pretty strong orthodoxy when it comes to nomination contests too. A book that came out just a few years ago, The Party Decides, is sort of the Bible for political scientists when it comes to nomination contests. And the overwhelming message of that book and that gospel is that, if you want to see who's going to win, forget the polls, forget almost everything other than money and party leader endorsements. And again, that's a little questionable early this year so far because on the Democratic side, I don't think there's ever been a non-incumbent presidential candidate with as much party elite support and endorsements as Hillary Clinton. Yet, she's hardly on an easy ride to the nomination by most measurements. And on the Republican side, the candidates with the fewest endorsements, Donald Trump, Ben Carson, Carly Fiorina, are precisely the ones that seem to have the most juice right now. Now, the quick answer for the fundamentalists, well, it's too early. I can remember in previous cycles hearing that same sort of thing, after Iowa or after New Hampshire. Too early. And you sort of
ask President Santorum.
Yeah, you sort of get the sense, though, that it's always going to be too early unless the right candidate, the preordained candidate, is winning or has won. So I think I certainly take that sort of talk with a grain of salt, too. It is obviously very early, but things are happening that will have some influence over the final result, or at least I think so.
Well, this is as game-changing an election as I can remember, certainly as a primary cycle. And I do think there's an argument to be made that if ever there was an election cycle where we have to be following the particulars and in and outs and daily weirdness of the races, this is it. And there's somebody I want to introduce now who probably follows that more than anyone that I know, and that's Julie Mason. As I said, she's the host of the Press Pool on SiriusXM Radio, channel 124. If you all don't have SiriusXM and listen to POTUS, you should. Julie, welcome to the program.
Paul, it's great to be on with you guys.
Julie, one of the things I love about your program is that I can't think of another one that gives beat political reporters, be they White House reporters, congressional reporters, or campaign reporters, the time and space that you do in your show to really wring them of all the relevant new information they have and get them engaged in some informed speculation.
Bypassing their editors.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Learn what didn't, fell on the cutting room floor. So I listen to your show and I learn a lot, and I know you must have learned a lot in the time you've been doing it. Is my sense, and I guess Ed's sense, that this is a particularly game-changing election. Yours too.
Yeah, and thank heavens it is. I mean, I don't know anyone who is excited at the prospect of a Bush v. Clinton campaign. Heading into this cycle, we all thought that's what it was going to be.
Well, Hillary Clinton, maybe.
Yeah, Hillary Clinton. She was looking forward to it, and they planned for that. You feel like, in many ways, they're still rolling out that game plan. It's terrible.
But for reporters, a completely different job.
Completely different. I mean, everyone talks about media bias. Reporters are biased in favor of something fun to cover, that's exciting, that throws out all the old conventions. They like conflict. They like things that are different. And boy, this whole cycle is really, it's been like a jobs program. You see places like CNN, like hiring up, like just staffing up for this big, crazy campaign, and it's just been wonderful after years and years of layoffs in the industry. So many people re-energized, re-excited about covering the campaign, and it keeping so many people busy at work.
Hey, are there any stars, any young people that, or even middle-aged folk like us who've just really begun to shine in this cycle? Who are you following?
There are some real up-and-comers, definitely worth watching. Casey Hunt at NBC News. She came up through Politico and the Associated Press and is now on TV, and she is really, really working hard. Also, Ashley Parker at the New York Times. This is her second presidential campaign cycle. Also someone really great to watch. It's great to watch these young reporters who bring a fresh eye, but they have experience, and they've kind of been milling about in the trenches, and now they're just starting to shine, and it's really wonderful to see. And just watching sort of the old curmudgeons of the news business, like the New York Times, like network TV, get up to speed with how BuzzFeed is covering the campaign. It's fun to watch them adapt. BuzzFeed, with a very strong phalanx of political reporters now, like getting serious about news coverage. It's not all viral cat videos. And then the New York Times finding ways to be more relevant, use more video, blog, have a little more voice and attitude, all trying to compete for the eyeballs and the ears of news consumers.
So Ed, you are also like Julie, just a voracious consumer of the political reporter's product. Do you have any favorites that are really beginning to shine that our listeners and viewers ought to be keeping track of?
Well, off the top of my head, Dave Weigel has always been one of my favorites. He's still very young, even though he's been around a while. He just recently went back to the Washington Post after a fairly long exile that most recently landed him at Bloomberg View. And the Post has sort of shunted him off into, I believe, sort of an embedded role with the Rand Paul campaign, which makes sense given Dave's own background, but not a very productive beat right now. But I hang on his every word. I think he's one of the best political reporters I've ever seen. I think some of the BuzzFeed people are actually pretty good. It's hard to identify somebody as a BuzzFeed person. As Julie knows, these people change jobs now pretty rapidly. So I'm loath to get into individual names because they may not be there anymore. I think there seem to be more people on the ground in Iowa this year than has recently been the case, covering that crazy place in a really granular sort of way. I mean, Russell Berman with The Atlantic, I just got through quoting one of his posts. I assume he's an older guy. I don't even know if he would be classified as a reporter or a pundit, but he did something nobody else has really done. He went into Iowa to figure out if there really is a Ben Carson campaign and came up with some answers. I would agree with Julie. There's just a lot going on, a lot of good writers coming along. I'd say the percentage of phoned in conventional wisdom reports from the campaign trail is way, way down to about 60% of the coverage this year. And that's very exciting to me. As you say, as a constant consumer.
Yeah. So Julie, what is new in this cycle in the relationship between the reporters and the campaigns, if there is
what's new. What's new?
Yeah.
Paul, did you ask me what's new?
Exactly.
Well, it's interesting because you see it's all over the place. Well, the biggest concern here in Washington among journalists has to do with access, and you see how the Obama administration has clamped down on access and messaging, and there's so much control. And it's a big concern that the next president who comes in is going to be even worse because they get progressively worse in terms of transparency and access. And you see Hillary Clinton hewing to that model. So much control, very little access, very little information, even routine information, like where are we going on Thursday? You just can't get it, can't shake it onto the campaign. And she is not available. She doesn't answer questions, and when she does, it goes haywire. It's really bad. And then you see the other extreme. Any reporter in town can get Donald Trump on the phone, right? and even Jeb Bush taking questions all the time from reporters. And then there's others, Chris Christie from time to time taking questions from reporters. And Rubio has a very strong contingent of Spanish language media following him, and he will go back and forth with them in Spanish. So the coverage, there's no consistent theme of the coverage, but it's very interesting to see how the different campaigns handle it. There's no one school of thought. I mean, there's just too many candidates right now. And, of course, the lower you are in the polls, it seems, the more accessible you are to the three journalists covering you. But at the same time, it really bodes well, I think, for this idea that it helps a candidate to be more accessible to the media and to even risk mistakes and risk a faux pas because it's going to get you some coverage, some attention at this time when it's really, really hard to break through with so many candidates.
Julie, I'm going to ask a really inside baseball question that you're probably uniquely qualified to answer. We've seen in the distant past occasionally when a reporter will be assigned to a hopeless dark horse campaign, the candidate succeeds, and so too does the journalist. I mean, the first I can remember is Julie Woodruff was assigned to the candidacy in 1976 of this hopeless long shot named Jimmy Carter. Considering the sort of topsy-turvy nature of certainly the Republican nominating contest, do you see some journalists getting very lucky with their assignments?
Yeah, but what usually happens is they'll put really young reporters and they'll embed them with a campaign, and then and they'll do all the legwork, they'll do all the groundwork, they'll get to know everyone in the campaign and know the candidate, and then the big guns will come in for the big interview. So there's always going to be, you know what I mean? You're always going to get big-footed when you're just starting out.
That's the term that I used to.
Mm-hmm.
We got big-footed a lot in my career.
Well, there's a similar phenomenon among the campaign operatives, which is known as "here come the hacks."
Right. As soon as it gets real, here come the people who, sure. That still goes on.
So let's talk a little bit. Let's bore down on just a couple of candidates here, Julie. You mentioned the Donald Trump and Ed, you did too. Is there a dynamic going on with Trump in that A, he's extremely accessible, B, he's polling well, but C, he's great copy, and so he gets far more coverage than perhaps he deserves or is good for the country by journalists who are trying to sell, and editors who are trying to sell stories. And I would point to Ben Carson and his relative lack of coverage over the last month or so as evidence that I'm right about that.
Right. No, that's definitely true. People forget there is definitely a public service component to journalism, and it's a very strong one. But at the same time, it's still a business. It's a business, and we go where the story is, and we pay attention to what people are paying attention to, and that leads to more Donald Trump coverage. Also, there's so much media now; it's so diffuse that there's a cacophony effect that's not intended, but you get the perception that everyone's covering Trump all the time, when really it's just every news organization doing one story, but then that ends up being hundreds and hundreds of stories. So you get this effect that it's this massive screaming mob, when really it's really individually it's not that much, but taken as a whole, it takes on like this sort of massive expression of news. So it's important to keep that in perspective. But yeah, sure. I mean, no one really cares about Rick Santorum, and even with the news business doing a little better than it was a few years ago, it's still kind of money down a rat hole to cover his campaign.
Yeah, I just noticed the way if you turn on MSNBC on any given evening, maybe a third of every show is about Donald Trump, and you look at the front page of the New York Times the next day, and there's virtually no political reporting and no political stories, and nothing about Donald Trump. It just is it's partly a sense that political reporters know what people are interested in, what sells, what they're interested in. And I'm not saying they're wrong to give a fair amount of coverage to Donald Trump, but there are, again, if you Google, right, politics, there's lots of stories about lots of other candidates, but they're not necessarily on the front page of all the websites or getting tweeted about much.
Right. You got to go looking for it. You can find it. It's there if you take a moment to look.
Yeah, let me go back to the discussion we had, I think, before Julie came on about, in my mind, this sort of two extreme perspectives from which to view presidential campaigns. One, sort of the political scientist community, involves looking at long-term fundamentals, and then you have kind of the game change impulses of political reporters. And sometimes you see that in news organizations where I think editorially they want to ignore Donald Trump or Ben Carson or all this craziness that's going on, but the reporters have to report something. And you're not going to be a very good political reporter if you're reporting on the president's job approval ratings every day, or what the GDP projections are, or for that matter, counting up endorsements by state legislators, which some political scientists think is the keys to the kingdom. So a guy like Trump is manna from heaven, but it's real. It's actually happening. It's not made up. The question is, and here's where I think what some of us do is not reporting. It's not punditry. It's analysis. That's where the analysis comes in, trying to understand what's happening, what it means. And then again, Trump is a big story. He represents a revolt, an apparent revolt by Republican rank and file members against all the orthodoxies of their own party's elites. That's a pretty big story.
Well,
yeah, you're right. You're right about all that, and it's a great story. It's a really terrific story. And it was I don't know, what was it, a couple months ago, that when Trump was on the rise and Bernie Sanders, and we all started defining what it was, like what was going on, what was up, and what these two candidates represented. And now it's become conventional wisdom, upending the system, the anti-politician, et cetera, the sort of anti-blow-dried Washington establishment candidate. And so it was an idea that germinated and has now become a theme. And we watched it. We watched it populate in the consciousness, and it's been wonderful to see. Really interesting analysis this year.
I'm particularly attuned to the notion of asymmetric polarization, that the things that are happening on the Republican side don't have an exact parallel on the Democratic side, and vice versa, even though it's convenient for reporters to write that way. I think the issue of outsider versus insider, the desire of the voter to shake things up, is one of those. And Julie, on your show just the other day, we talked about some fantastic statistics that showed that 75 or so % of Democrats are looking for a candidate with, maximum experience in public office, and 75+% of Republicans are looking for somebody with no experience in public office. And so you see on the Republican side, a majority of polled likely Republican voters supporting either of the three, or a sum of the three candidates. That would be Donald Trump, Ben Carson, and Carly Fiorina, who among them have had exactly 0 days in public service. And on the Democratic side, obviously there's nobody who's an actual outsider. Bernie Sanders is an outsider ideologically, sort of, kind of, in that he's a self-identified socialist, but he's a, veteran Senate, Washington senator, and
House member before that.
House member before that,
and a mayor before that.
Yeah, right.
So, while I do think that it's true that you have this unbelievable outsider demand on the Republican side, I don't really see it at all on the Democratic side.
No, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And as you pointed out, Paul, it goes to the heart of something fundamental about both parties, which is Democrats believe in government. They believe in the efficacy of government and the usefulness of government, and Republicans believe the opposite.
Yeah, and more so every year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so how would you view, Julie, the coverage of the Democratic side of things? Really it's now, if you again, turn on the news or you read the papers, it's really a question of Bernie Sanders' surge versus Hillary Clinton's self-inflicted email wound, and how will it play out? Is that a fair estimation of the coverage, and is that what you think is happening?
It's true, and there's every 10 days or so, there's more stories, very bemused, very wry, about Hillary Clinton is remaking her campaign. She's starting over. She's resetting her relationship with reporters, trying to come off as this, that, and the other such. And so there's a strain of that as well. And there's an exhaustion already to the coverage of Hillary Clinton. It was, it's already been not quite a year since papers like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post assigned full-time journalists, some of their top journalists, to cover the Hillary Clinton campaign. I mean, they've been out there doing this on this cycle for a really long time now. And you get the sense that they're going through the motions, and voters are going through the motions, and to a certain extent the Clinton campaign is going through the motions. So there's this sense of boredom and exhaustion on the Democratic side, and not much happening with the down ballot candidates. Poor Martin O'Malley, he's trying to organize a rally outside of the DNC, and it's kind of like, boy, is anyone going to show up? And yet, so here we have Ted Cruz and Donald Trump organizing a rally on the steps of the Capitol. Everyone, the world is going to go to that, and that's going to be crazy. And so there's just this sense of not really much happening on the Democratic side. And also there's a sense, I would say, there's a strain of blaming the Clintons a little bit for elbowing people out of the race who might have made it more interesting for the Democratic Party, like where's Kirsten Gillibrand, Amy Klobuchar, Andrew Cuomo? Well, they got sidelined by the Clintons. So if it's boring, it's kind of the Clintons' fault in a way. And so, reap the whirlwind.
So, Julie, would this sort of Clinton fatigue or Clinton boredom be the reason for this, to me, just bizarre coverage of the non-candidacy of Joe Biden? I mean, I think even if he issued a Sherman statement right now, the headline would be, Joe Biden does not, cut his own flesh to swear against the presidential campaign. Is this a sort of the flip side of Clinton fatigue, or am I just overinterpreting it?
Yeah, no, I think Clinton fatigue surely has something to do with it, and a lot of journalists covering the Democratic side of the race would certainly like to see a little more excitement, a little more suspense brought into it. But part of it is they really feel like there's more disclosures about the Clintons to come out, and if the Democratic Party is left with Bernie Sanders or Martin O'Malley, that's not going to work, and so they expect a channel to open for Joe Biden.
Well, I mean, if I've been arguing now for months that if Hillary Clinton does implode, what's to keep the Kirsten Gillibrands from reemerging? Are Democrats really? Is Joe Biden really the only alternative they have?
He's done it before. He's got
not very successfully.
No, not very successful, but he knows what it takes. He has experienced people. I mean, how does Kirsten Gillibrand cobble together a presidential campaign, like add water and stir, But Joe Biden really can do that.
Well, I think if if we get from fears about Hillary Clinton imploding to Hillary Clinton imploding, I think you'd have a whole lot of cooks in the kitchen ready to stir up some sort of instant campaign for them. I don't think that'd be a problem at all. I guess maybe the real problem is this sort of weird middle ground between now and, maybe the fear is that she'll implode the day after she locks up the nomination or something. I don't know.
Well, there's semi-precedence for this, right? And that is John Edwards in 2008, right? There were hints of John Edwards having fathered a child out of wedlock all through the press corps throughout that campaign, and it only became public knowledge, and the reporters only covered it, in the few weeks, if memory serves, a few weeks before the Democratic convention. And by then, his star had faded, but not because of that. And had he done well, you could imagine going into the convention with a candidate who, 3 weeks before the convention, turns out is not only sired a child out of wedlock, but was keeping the mom and son on his payroll.
Well, I'm gonna show my senescence here, but the other side of the coin is in 1988. When there were rumors for months and months and months that George H.W. Bush's mistress was going to be exposed. In fact, there was a rumor one day that the story was about to break, and the stock market dropped about 200 points, which was a big deal back then. So sometimes the long-awaited disaster doesn't happen.
True.
I think that the long-awaited disaster with Hillary is this email scandal. The weird thing about this whole email scandal, which, I think there are real issues here that need to be fleshed out, and we need to get to the bottom of whether what she did was appropriate, legal, et cetera, or not. But what I find pretty just fascinating is that we would not know of this whole email scandal, but for two things. One, a weird Romanian hacker with backers in Russia who hacked into Sidney Blumenthal's email account, and B, the Trey Gowdy committee in the House, the 8th committee to look into Benghazi. And, should it turn out that there's no there, and I'm not saying there is no there, but should it turn out that there's no there, we're going to look back on that Trey Gowdy committee and say, this is whitewater too. This is, a case where an ill-advised impaneling of subpoena-powered politicians was allowed to kind of go on a fishing expedition till they found something that they could bring down a Clinton with. And maybe what's going to come out is enough damage to her reputation based on her use of private email that it we'll look back in history and say, thank God for Trey Gowdy, right? He and Larry Klayman were finally able to. But we could look back and say, my God, it happened to the Clintons again.
Yeah,
well,
I don't know. Yeah,
that's
maybe.
So do you have a prediction about where the Democratic coverage will go over the next? You've mentioned that the campaign, Hillary's campaign, keeps trying to reboot. They're going to be, she's going to be more humorous and heartfelt, and they weirdly advertise that fact to the press, right?
Right. They telegraph that, and then she follows suit, and then there's another disclosure, and then she locks down again and gets surly, and then that has to play out. This is the pattern for years, so I think it's just going to continue in this vein.
Yeah, and she doesn't have, I think, a chance to get out in front of this story until the story is out, and maybe that's the first debate where she gets hammered on it and has to finally answer it in a public way, under maximum fire, or it's her appearance in front of Trey Gowdy's Benghazi Commission. But none of that's going to happen until October.
Right around the time of the first debate.
That's right.
Well, to get back to my just to speak for my political science buddies that I hung out with this weekend, most of them would argue that 96 to 98% of voters are going to vote for their party's nominee, even if it's the Lord Satan, and that the assumption that there are millions and millions of swing voters out there following things like Hillary Clinton's email scandal and trying to make up their minds which way to go is just a fable. A convenient fable for people that have to write about politics all the time, of course. And, in catnip to those of us who grew up with the median voter theory and the idea that, indeed, swing voters do control the outcome of elections. But, there's an argument to be made that whatever ultimately comes out of the email scandal or any other scandal, unless it's really lethal, probably is not going to control the outcome of the election. I mean,
that's fair enough. Yeah, that sounds right. Sure.
So, what are you going to be looking for in the next week or so? What are going to be the big stories? What should we keep our eyes on? I mean, we've been talking all this time about campaigns. Is anything in Washington going to matter for those campaigns? It's going to be happening in the next week or month.
Yeah, we have Congress is back in session, so we have Ted Cruz, Rand Paul, Bernie Sanders, Marco Rubio, and whom I forget, one other. Who else is running from the Senate? There's 5.
You stumped us.
I gotta go. Okay. I gotta go through my mental list.
Yeah, there's okay.
I can probably name all the ex-governors, but I can't name all the senators.
So they're all back in Washington. We have a huge fight over the budget. We have
Lindsey Graham. Lindsey Graham.
Thank you, Lindsey Graham. All right, so those 5, they're all coming back. So at least 2, possibly 3 of those are going to be stirring it up on the budget. We might have a government shutdown because of funding Planned Parenthood. This is Ted Cruz trying to get some attention, trying to get something done or not done here in Washington. And Rand Paul, of course, his campaign on the fade out as well. He's got to be plotting something. He's planning something back there. So I think the action for a little bit is going to shift to Washington, some of the focus, some of the attention, because with Congress down, it's been all out on the campaign trail. Now it's back here, but then, of course, Trump will do something and we'll be back on it again.
On the Planned Parenthood story, I have a question just in case you have any guesses to the answer. The impression I'm getting is that the big mainline right-to-life groups have basically told Boehner and McConnell that, no, don't shut down the government over Planned Parenthood. It'll backfire. We want to win the election. That's the way to reverse Roe v. Wade and kill Planned Parenthood. Just don't go there. But then you have all these candidates and rank-and-file anti-choice folk who may think otherwise. So you could see a revolt not simply against, these rhinos, who aren't really true conservatives, but even against the organized right to life movement. Are you picking up any of that?
Yeah, definitely. That's very clearly happening. And Boehner and McConnell both saying we're not shutting down the government, but I mean, it's not really up to them.
As we see.
That'd be fun.
We had Melinda Henneberger on a show recently, and we were talking about, does the end of the summer, i.e. the end of the silly season, mean that substance comes back to both the campaigns and what they're talking about and the coverage of the campaigns? And I'd like to think, when there's a visit from the Pope and we're discussing fundamental issues of ideology and existential religion and so forth, or we've got a budget to pass, or the deal on Iran needs to come to a vote, that the whole discussion moves to the substantive parts of substantive issues.
Paul, live and dream. Live and dream.
I know, and I felt myself sort of being walking on thin ice there, and Melinda, kindly walked me back to the shore. But so that's your sense, is that Donald Trump can kind of walk in at any moment and start talking, throw out a new issue that nobody thought they would be talking about.
Right, exactly. One hopes, and I do hope that now that we're post Labor Day, getting into the fall season, now soberer minds will prevail. But there's no guarantees. We can't predict anything anymore. We're out of the prediction business, Paul. All of us, all three of us, we're done.
Yeah, well, I am.
Yeah, no, I haven't gotten most of this wrong. So I won't then hold either of you to predictions on this show. We'll just leave it that it's a more game-changing election than we've seen in a while, and in the spirit of Julie's show, which I think I'm fair in describing as taking tremendous joy in watching the spectacle of these things. I think we'll leave it there for the day. No predictions. We'll just continue to watch the spectacle and report on it and analyze it for you folks who come to view our show. Thank you, Julie Mason, for being on our show. Ed Kilgore, thank you to you, and we'll see you all next week at the Washington Monthly Show.